So our next panel is entitled Opportunities to Serve and Have Impact. And it's the panelists are Greg Hager, Henning Schulzring, and Andreas Bashum. Sorry, I didn't check pronunciations first. So I see Greg has some slides, so please begin.
All right, thank you, Mark. First, I have to apologize. I've got a little bit of a cold, so hopefully you can decode what I'm saying amidst that. So we don't have a lot of time for this panel, so I don't want to spend a lot of time with background, but just I thought I would give a little bit of a perspective of really my experience over the last 10 years participating largely through CRA in activities in the government sphere. And of course, like any academic, I prepared slides because I'm unable to speak without slides, but if not, we'll go anyway. So I thought I'd follow up, just really pick up on what Peter was talking about with the discussion of, with the discussion of how policy is made in DC. And so maybe I'll do this without slides, just since it seems like they're not going to go. To kind of start as a background, I mean, Peter just gave you kind of a rapid overview of all the different ways you can participate. And I can try it again. You never know. So Peter talked a lot about the different ways you can participate and the different things you can do, and over my time I've served on the CCC, I've served on the CRA board, I've had an opportunity to participate in some higher level working groups and report writing. But the first thing I wanted to do before kind of getting into a little bit of a personal dialogue around that is to kind of take a step back and kind of make an analogy that I've used a couple of times, which is, when you think about science policy and about having an impact, I like to say it's a lot like a game of soccer. If you're an American and you come in and you're used to like American football where these organized plays and you kind of work your way down the field, you come and you look at soccer and it just looks like a chaotic mess. You watch this game, you can watch it for an hour and the ball goes up and down the field and people are running back and forth and it doesn't seem like anything is happening. But then every now and then things come together in just the right way and all of a sudden the ball goes into the goal and it's a big deal that somebody's made a goal. And in my experience, that's a good way to think about science policy. If you're playing soccer, you're not going to make a goal if the ball's not down in the right end of the field and people aren't in the right position to do it. And so a lot of what you're doing most of the time is really just kind of being, as Peter suggested, you're kind of being out there. You're kind of making sure that your message is there. You're making sure that there are people in the right places. And sometimes it just happens to work out that you've got the right people in the right place and you've got the right message and you've got the right person listening, and suddenly you can actually make a goal. So the kind of my personal story about this that I thought I'd tell, because when I tell it at that level, it's pretty abstract, is kind of as you'll see, an evolution of activities that ultimately led to a bill in Congress. So as I said, I joined the CCC in about 2011. I became the vice chair in 2013, and the chair at the time was Susan Graham from UC Berkeley. And Susan was a member of Obama's President's Council of Advisors in Science and Technology. It's a committee that meets to advise the president on science and technology. And part of what PCAST does is it actually reviews an organization in computer science or in computing called NIDRD, the National Information Networking Technology and Development. I can't do the acronym off the top of my head organization. It basically is a coordinating body that oversees federal investments in computing broadly. And it's supposed to be reviewed every 2 years by this committee. So because she was on PCAST, she got asked to lead the review. She asked me to co-chair the review. So what this really means is we both looked at what this organization did, and we looked at, went out to the computing field and tried to understand relative to what this organization was doing, what it was reviewing, what committees it had, what it had going on, how does that match up with the field? And then we would write a report that basically said, here's how we think this committee relates to the field. So this in itself was an interesting activity because you're really saying, let's look at all of computer science, everything going on. how does this committee represent it? How does it, how do the working groups it has relate to it? It's really taking a very broad perspective. And I should say that by and large, this committee, or this working group would meet every 2 years. They would do a report. And once this report was finished, it would go to PCAST, it would get presented. It actually gets signed by the president. But by and large, that was kind of the end of it. It's a review process that allowed PCAST to know what was going on in this organization. So for whatever reason, in the year that we did it, Congress took an interest in this report. So we wrote the report, we presented it to PCAST, you know, it went to the president, it got signed by the president. It was kind of cool. I've got a piece of paper that the president's actually signed with stuff in it that I've written. And then all of a sudden we got a call saying, hey, the subcommittee of space science and technology, the research and technology subcommittee, the space science and technology committee, would like you to come and present the results of your report. Well, the reason they wanted us to present the results of the report is it turned out there's a bill in Congress that they were considering. And as part of that bill, they decided that they would consider renewing the congressional support for this particular program. So in fact, I went to Congress. Peter actually had a picture in his presentation of us, you know, in the subcommittee hearing room. It was me, Keith Marzullo, who was here yesterday. I don't think he's here today. And Ed Seidel from the University of Illinois, who came, and we presented this report to Congress. Just to understand, when you present a report to Congress, there are two pieces to it. One piece is you actually send them a written report before you ever show up. They give you 3 minutes, if I remember right, to talk about whatever you want to talk about. And then you sit there for the next hour, hour and a half, and they ask you questions, and you have to pretty much on the fly be able to answer their questions. And all the time you're in your head trying to do the calculus of, you know, what are they really trying to get after with this question? How does it reflect the computing research field and all that? So it's an interesting process, suffice to say, to do this. To make a long story short, we went through that. We got a set of questions back afterwards that we responded to. And if I had the slides up, one of the things I was going to point out is in those responses, in fact, we used the tire track chart that Peter showed you because it actually supported the case that we were trying to make about information technology and its importance in the field. So a lot of these resources that were around, we're able to now pull together and actually focus directly on questions that were being asked by Congress about the computing field. And actually, one of the questions they had is, what are important areas for research in the future? And this was kind of an interesting question because you could imagine you could very quickly create haves and have-nots with that question. What's important in the future? Well, I do robotics, so I think robotics and computer vision is really important in the future. Architecture, we clearly don't need any of that anymore because Moore's law is finished. But we didn't say that, of course. We said something more politically correct that said, look, technology evolves. What's important now is going to change, and what's really important is that we have an ongoing, robust conversation to support the computing field as its priorities and as the technology advances. And to make a long story short, in 2016, if I remember right, Congress passed the American Innovation and Competitiveness Act. And the neat thing about it is if I go and I look in that bill, there are actually lines that we wrote in our report and lines that we wrote in our responses to Congress that actually made it directly into that bill to support the language that they needed to pass this. So, you know, again, the reason I started with the soccer analogy is to just, not so much that you know, I happen to be, you know, super successful and make this happen, or a committee was super successful and made it happen, but it just happened to be the right set of breadcrumbs that we're able to put together to actually have that sort of impact. And I think that's the main thing that I'd like for you to carry away, is that I think it's important, as Peter said, for people to be involved and to understand this process, because you never know when you might be the right person that you know, CRA needs to come and testify to Congress about your area of research. Or you might be the right person who happens, because you're in this milieu, you happen to get called to be on one of these advisory committees, and it turns out that advisory committee does something that suddenly is of interest to some other part of Congress, And it's really only if we have enough people and kind of enough of those pieces together that when the right time aligns, you can actually put together that shot on goal and you can actually make it. So that's just a kind of a personal perspective on it, but I hope by that personal perspective you see it really is an exciting and interesting opportunity to work as academic in science policy. Thank you.
All right, so, no, go on up.
I'm going to try the slides and see if that works.
So Henning Schulring is next of Columbia University, and he will have slides for himself and maybe you.
Okay, so let me just wing it without it, which probably is just as well. I wanted to, it's actually a fairly natural continuation of a discussion that we had early on, Peter talking about kind of the various engagement models that we've had. Maybe I should just give a little bit of personal background to the extent that it's relevant, because it's a slightly unusual in the sense that it's fairly common. I suspect you will be asked at every NSF panel that you're at to serve as an NSF program officer of some sort at the NSF in that, and I'm sure in the next session that will be repeated for good reason. For historical accident, I work in computer networking, so I've done a lot of work generally at the application layer, and I got engaged with the Federal Communication Commission. So I served in one form or another from about 2010 to 2017 at the FCC, just stone throw away from this building here in that. And so my perspective is driven by that. And it's interesting, not so much because of a personal history, because I think I've explored pretty much all the avenues in that arena in various ways, and maybe have some experience as to what worked and maybe what the trade-offs are. So in some parts I was full-time, in some cases I was part-time, like 1 day a week. In some cases I was much more, and continue to be actually, more removed more than it is. So let me tell you something about maybe that hasn't come across in that. So you've probably all had some basic kind of civics education, maybe by osmosis or reading the newspaper type of thing, or maybe more formal. We tend to think of kind of the executive branch, the judicial branch, and legislative branch that we talked about extensively before. But we also have this oddball thing that is somewhat in between, namely the regulatory agencies in that. So in our field, largely, I think those are two, namely the Federal Communications Commission and the Federal Trade Commission. So kind of as a hint, and I'm not sure if this is completely true, but as a good approximation, anytime you have something which ends with a C, namely a commission, and has 3 letters, it is probably some version of an independent regulatory commission that may be attached to something, but it is often is an independent thing. And what distinguishes these commissions is that they're an attempt to, so they're not formally part of the executive branch. They're not an agency or sub-agency like a Federal Aviation Administration type of model. They are so-called independent regulatory agencies. They are indeed commissions, as in they are staffed by commissioners. So in the case of typically around 5 is a typical number. So the FCC and FTC fall into that, where the commission, unlike in a federal agency like you might have at the Department of Transportation and any of the department ones, the cabinet level one, where the hierarchy is pretty much staffed by the president once they get around to actually appointing people to head that, and the agency is staffed by the associate and deputies and so on, which are all more or less part of the same political orientation that of the president. The federal regulatory commissions, the FTC and FCC in particular, are a little different beast. So they are staffed by these commissioners that are appointed by Congress, but are nominally independent of Congress and the executive branch. So for example, the FCC, which I'm most familiar with, has 5 commissioners, like I mentioned. The chairman is appointed by the president, is of the president's party, but 2 out of the 5 are of the minority party. So in this case, there are 2 Democrats and 3 Republicans on the commission, and indeed, nominally speaking, although that's not practically the case, the chairman would actually serve a term beyond. They have 5-year terms, independent of a presidential term in that. So the interesting part about that is that as Congress has essentially ceased doing the work that the Constitution anticipates, namely making laws of consequence besides the budget, a lot of the effective lawmaking, which in other systems that are more parliamentary in nature, like the European Union or individual European countries and Japan and Korea and so on, are done by their respective parliaments. In the US, much of what we would see kind of in a classical civics textbook taking place at the legislative level has been delegated down explicitly and kind of by omission to the regulatory agencies. So for example, in Europe, just to pick an example that has garnered some attention, network neutrality, open internet type of issues are handled by the European Parliament and indirectly by national parliaments in the European Union countries. In the US, Congress has, even though the internet is not exactly new anymore, has failed in 20+ years to pass anything to update the communication laws that govern communication. So just as a kind of indicator of inaction, the last major revision of the US communication policy, US communication laws, was done in 1996. Which in itself was a revision of 1934 laws. The 1996 law does not mention the internet at all, except in one part, which was later tossed out by the Supreme Court, communication decency part. But otherwise, it has essentially no mention of the internet. And Congress has, through those years, been unable to deal with that. The world doesn't stand still, so regulatory agencies, by necessity, particularly when they're more activist inclinations in the White House, tend to step in. So that's both bad. I don't think that's necessarily a good way to run a country, but it is also good because these agencies are often called expert agencies because a large part of their staff are supposed to be experts, not necessarily engineering experts or science experts, but law and economics experts. So the FCC and the FTC, largely it's kind of the old joke, kind of an economist and a lawyer and engineer walk into a federal building type of thing. And that's roughly what goes on. Namely, you're classified when you walk into those agencies, so to say, you wear one of these hats. That's the only thing they care about, is they know you as, quote, an engineer in the case of the Federal Communications Commission. I don't know what the FTC does that, but they don't have quite as much engineering, or you're a lawyer one, and you're treated as a generic specimen of that, as in, just like a lawyer is supposed to have broad knowledge, when you walk into these agencies, you're treated as you should know everything possible about communication, whether this is your, or computing or whatever, even though that may not be actually your specialty. So let me talk a little bit about why these matter, because many of the issues that we care about in computing actually are handled by these regulatory agencies. So for example, the FCC worries about digital inclusion for communication, but also indirectly for computing. It worries about spectrum, radio type of spectrum. It worries about radiation, electromagnetic radiation safety, if you're on that side. It worries about healthcare, at least the computing and communication side often. It worries about emergency services. So if you're worried about access to 911 or FirstNet came indirectly out of that arena. It worries, at least that has been down-delegated, if you like, on cybersecurity. It gets involved in infrastructure issues and so on. The Federal Trade Commission worries about anything related to consumers, so that includes, again, cybersecurity to some extent, privacy. So many of the hot-button issues that we deal with, the concept of consequences of computing, are supposed to be handled by these regulatory communities, commissions, and that. So one important thing, just kind of to point out, is that going to the FTC, FCC, or any of these similar type of regulatory agencies asking for money is at best hopeless and at worst clueless. So this is not, they don't generally, there's exceptions, they don't generally hand out money. And I'll mention one exception, which actually is kind of interesting. I don't know if you've seen the article in Communication ACM on an effort that was 2 months ago or so that was used where the FCC auctioned off parts of a TV spectrum that's used for TV, over-the-air TV stations in that, and which was called the incentive auction, and it turned out to be an extremely challenging computational problem. Think of it as a map coloring problem thrown in with an optimization and cloud computing problem, and so that was funded indirectly through the FCC. But generally speaking, not so much. So what can you do? Yep. What can you do to engage? So the first one is you can have and this is kind of what you should do early on, is look at whether there are regulatory issues you care about and can you comment. Often academic comments are treated quite seriously because they're not seen as just being advocacy in that. They can be quite influential in that and are relatively easy done. Often this is best done as part of a group, not just individually in that. Secondly, they often like to hear about research. Present to staff in that. So if you believe that you have research that is relevant to privacy and the other topics I mentioned, see if you can find somebody who at those commissions who's interested in what you have to do. They often hold workshops. That's a good way to engage with those entities in that. As mentioned, they have advisory committees that they have. Often this is done based on personal knowledge, so once you do these other things, you're more likely to be pointed to one of these advisory committees. And later on, they are happy to often have academics who are there on sabbatical because they don't cost them anything, at least initially. And they can then, so you can do a half-year or a year type of engagement in there if you have funding to do that. And then finally, you can, this is rare, but you can actually do an IPA type of appointment, namely where you're deputized or where you're on leave from your home institution to work in these agencies. And maybe we can discuss all of those just a little bit later in detail.
Thanks. Okay, next we have Andreas Bascom of the Congressional Innovation Fellowship.
Yeah, hi, my name is Andres Bascom. I am not an academic, so I don't have a cool slide deck, but I am here to talk to you about fellowships, fellowships particularly on Capitol Hill. A little background on me. I serve as a congressional staffer in the Energy and Commerce Committee for Representative Jerry Connolly and for the Oversight and Government Reform Committee in the IT subcommittee. I now work at Tech Congress, which is a program based out of New America. Tech Congress places technologists in a one-year policymaking fellowship on Capitol Hill. And I'm just going to tell you a brief history of, since it looks like we're running a little bit behind schedule, a brief history on how Tech Congress came to be and you know, what it might be like to be a fellow in Congress, if that's something you're considering. So Tech Congress's founder was also a congressional staffer. He worked on the Energy and Commerce Committee and realized during the drafting of the Affordable Care Act that it was really helpful to have doctors on staff. Doctors that were able to give a perspective of how the legislation would actually affect constituents on the ground. Those doctors weren't actual congressional staff. They were fellows from a program called the Robert Wood Johnson's Fellows Program. And you realize this actually might be something that we could translate into other sectors on Capitol Hill. And that's how Tech Congress came to be born. Tech issues on Capitol Hill are really not understood well. I know that firsthand because I was a tech advisor in all of the positions that I held. And I'm a lawyer by trade. I have no technical background, I have no expertise, and it was really difficult trying to legislate and draft policy and properly advise the members of Congress I was working for on these issues that were way over my head, and that I was expected to pick up fairly quickly. And what that resulted in was me looking outside of Congress for that kind of information and being able to digest and disseminate that information back to members of Congress. So I would reach out to think tanks, to industry, to civil society, and always having to remember while receiving that information that there's always a spin to it, right? Everyone that comes in and presents before Congress or gives information to Congress is trying to represent their own personal interest. And if that interest aligns with the member of Congress you're working for, then great. You can give that information straight to them and build legislation on that. But if it doesn't, you could end up getting caught up in a situation where your member is not happy with you, or you end up pushing potential legislation that's helping one part of an interest of someone and not the other. And what would have been really helpful would have been to have technologists on staff with us, in-house, that have an unbiased opinion and can give valuable viewpoints to what we needed to do. So Tech Congress does that exact thing. Through the one-year policymaking fellowship, it's for mid-career technologists. We let them serve as basically staffers. They draft legislation, they take stakeholder meetings, and they advise members of Congress directly. They serve as senior staffers within a committee or within a personal office. And we're in our third year now of Tech Congress. And there's not actually many tech-specific fellowships on Capitol Hill. There are a lot of fellowships that have different tech policy routes, but we right now at Tech Congress are the only ones that focus specifically on technologists. Our application actually opened in early July, and if you guys are interested in the 2019 cycle, please reach out to me. I'll have some cards after. But I figure that you guys would prefer to just ask me questions on what it's like to serve in Congress and serve as a fellow in Congress as well. So thank you.
Okay, so we have some time for questions, so please go to the microphone and state your name and affiliation. While we're waiting, does the panel want to ask questions of each other? Well, I have a question. So, Andreas, can you say what motivated you to, go and serve in Congress and government?
Sure. Wow, that's a deep question. I personally just fell into it, but once I did fall into it, I served as an intern for my member of Congress when I was in college. But once I got into it, I realized that it's the easiest way to have a direct impact and to see the people that you're helping. You face them one-on-one every day, either through the phone or if they're coming into the office, and you can see how the work that you put in puts out legislation. Not often, because not many bills pass through both houses of Congress anymore, but actually affects people. I think a great example of that would probably be the Affordable Care Act. Depending on your political leaning, it was a success or a failure, but it did actually impact people's lives. So I think it's about public service in the purest sense. Yeah.
Okay, Almadina, introduce yourself and your question.
Good morning. My name is Almadina Shilkanova. I'm a program director at NSF. I missed yesterday's talks, but what I realized today is that we never mentioned social implications of technology development and predicting maybe how it can affect the society. So this is what I think is missing currently. And without taking any political sides and everything, what I think computer scientists and scientists in general, they are missing understanding that there is a implication and there are consequences of technological development. An example would be manipulating of, opinions, right? This is what people in business and marketing kind of doing a long time, but it's not a part of scientific endeavor. So would CCC, CRA at least consider adding people who know how humans think about technology? And I think it would be a great impact if it's scientifically explored. So it was not a question, but I would like to see to hear your opinion on it.
No, I think that's a great comment. And, we are, and, I think if you look at computer science today versus 20 years ago, you're exactly right. There's this intimate connection between people and technology that just didn't exist 20 years ago, and that's only going to continue to grow. So one thing I will say, so A, I agree. B, I would say, for example, as you probably know at NSF, there are a lot of discussions about how we can actually think about the human technology frontier and how we bring thinking about social impact and kind of personal interaction into the technology space. When we did the NIDR review that I mentioned, that actually was one of the major themes that we went into, was to say that one of the evolutions of computing, by way of background, the original High Performance Computing Act that funded NIDR-D was 1991, and so the main language was high performance computing. How many supercomputers do we need and how do we share them better? And that language actually remained in the bill. And so a lot of what we talked about was the fact that computing now has evolved to be a much more personal resource. It's much more intimately connected to society, and that there needs to be a more holistic view of computing in that regard. I will say the interesting little side story of that hearing I did, which I didn't talk about, was that, as you know, there's a lot of question in Congress about exactly what role NSF should play in that space. And Lamar Smith, of course, has been a vocal discussant, shall we say, in the conversation. And when we did the presentation of the NIDR report, he actually was in the room, and so I was waiting for a lightning rod, to come out and strike me down when we started to talk about the importance of understanding social impacts of computing. And actually, he was very positive in general for both broadly supporting computing, and certainly did not say that was not something that computing itself should go into. So I took that as a very positive sign. And as you know, Congress has been very supportive of computing research. So I think there is that conversation going on, and I'm hopeful that will continue to advance that particular agenda, because I do agree it's very important.
So I'll just make one quick comment, because I think we tend to think of technology kind of just raining down on society and doing its thing. One thing that I certainly, after returning to Columbia, that I did that tries to fix that a little bit, that notion, is namely I'm teaching a course called Internet Technology, Economics, and Policy, because what I think is that we should think of as more of feedback loops of various sort that occur, as in technology gets shaped by law and economics. And most engineering students certainly seem to have very little understanding of the law and economics side. So in my small way, I try to set up a course which teaches engineering students that industry structures and how technology is translated into societal impact isn't just happen automatically. It's mediated through economic structures, regulatory structures, legal frameworks, and so the impact, for example, of robotics in Sweden is very different than the impact of robotics in Japan, is in fact different in the US, and it helps understand both. So we shouldn't just think of us going into NSF, regulatory agencies, whatever. It's also, once you've done that, bringing that experience back to the classroom and maybe less visibly into research, that is kind of the indirect impact that we can have. And I think the more people have had your experience, and maybe others who have worked in NSF or regulatory agencies, the better we can tell students, hey, it's more than just learning how to program or learn how to understand operating systems. It's understanding that the economic and legal structures shape technology into impact.
Hello, I'm Andrea Barbin from IBM Watson Health, and so far the conversation's been very U.S. focused and centered, and in my previous career I was the international telecom attorney. I worked for a while for die Bundesnetzagentur für Telekommunikation, the regulator in Germany, and so I'm wondering if you could speak to perhaps opportunities to be involved either with the International Telecommunications Union, the ITU, or if there are any other opportunities through different organizations to meet bilaterally with other countries or other international bodies. Thank you.
I can't say something, I'll speak from a somewhat limited perspective on that because you mentioned telecom and I know a little bit about that area. So there's two things that I can say as answers. There are opportunities that we haven't talked about which are kind of in the intersection of governmental and non-governmental, namely there is AID and other US organizations as well as international development organizations are often very keen to have technologists, as they generally tend to refer to them generically, but practically it means computer science folks mostly, who to both help on the policy more side as well as the kind of more program side as well as kind of a more on the ground type of side. So that is a real one. I know IEEE has a fellowship for a State Department fellowship in that. Again, this is US centric in that. But there are opportunities against them. Thinking most people are at least US based, to do that even from the US to have an international impact as well. Now, again, it doesn't, even if you're US, I've worked with BEREC, which is the European regulatory agencies through the FCC, but also otherwise and through various. So there are opportunities to go beyond if you tend to be frustrated by the US political system. It's just a little harder practically to make that happen because they won't know you as well. And it's a lot of that is personal relationship, so it's really harder to do that unless you have some that you can leverage.
Maybe just kind of one quick picking up one thought you had. So there are, obviously, ACM, IEEE are international organizations. And, kind of going back to how do you become involved and eventually have, the ability to have an impact. A lot of times you start doing something, you volunteer for something in an organization, and kind of by volunteering and becoming part of the conversation, you can start to kind of steer your activity towards something you're interested in. So if you're truly interested in international, one place to start would be with IEEE or ACM. Look at what sort of committees or organized activities they have in the international space, and basically try to get involved in those activities because they would be a natural platform then to become more involved in activities at an international scope.
I'd also like to add too, there's other opportunities in the U.S. government that have an international flavor. For example, Margaret Martinosi and Stephanie Forrest recently were Jefferson Scholars at the U.S. State Department. I mean, I'd like to be a Jefferson Scholar. That sounds pretty cool. All right, any more questions? Yes? Okay.
I'm Joseph Osborne, Pomona College. So I'm in California. I'm actually, I think, almost about as far away as you can be from Washington, D.C. and still be in the United States, continental United States. So if I wanted to have some kind of impact at the national level, does that make sense at all without me flying to D.C. every couple of months or something? Is that feasible at all?
Yes.
Okay.
But no, I mean, certainly, I think, again, my abstraction is, first, what do you want to, what would you like to be involved in? I mean, there's no question that being present in D.C. is important and plays an important role if you want to actually, be testifying to Congress or something, right? You're not going to do that remotely. But I think there's a lot you can do just to be informed, to kind of become engaged and involved and know what's going on. So for example, Peter runs a government affairs mailing list where issues that are coming up get put out on a blog, and you get to read about them and kind of know and weigh in. And so, it's not like you have to get on a plane every month and come back to DC. You can be a little bit more targeted than that. But I think the first question is, what do you want to do and how do you want to get involved in that particular conversation? The other thing, I guess, and Peter could probably say more about this, is, again, state and local politics are often almost as important as national. And so looking to see what you could do in California, I think, would also be a good first start to being able to do something maybe at a national level.
And these days, given the dysfunction in Congress, many of the states, particularly California, are probably, practically speaking, more important. The network neutrality stuff is largely happening now at the state level. Environmental protection largely happening at the state level, autonomous vehicles, state level. So there's a lot of things that are happening, and even big cities. So I'm currently working with New York City, the Department of Information Technology, on their network, on broadband mapping and broadband performance evaluation. New York City is not a small part, so you can actually have an impact locally, and it's a lot easier simply because the hierarchies, you can do it. If you as a faculty come talk to the CTO of San Francisco, you can probably get an appointment if you have something to contribute, or you just want to find out how to engage. They're often, from my experience, very happy to talk to faculty simply because they're not being pitched something that they have to buy.
And
okay.
As a follow-up, do I not have time?
That'd be quick.
Okay, is CCC or CRA, is there guidance for working with local or state bodies as there is for their involvement at the national level?
Not a whole lot, unfortunately, because we don't have really any presence in the States, just as a resource issue. I can certainly steer you to stuff, though.
I can make this quick. Building on his question, and I'm Tawana Dillahunt, University of Michigan, and maybe this is a question more for Andres. I'm just curious, how can faculty best communicate to you guys? You said you called people, to get information because you weren't an expert. How did you go about searching for people to find? I mean, were you reading our articles? Were you watching YouTube videos? How did you go about doing that, and how can we make that process easier for you guys?
Yeah, I think Peter really touched on this before, but it's all about the trust that you have with these different sources. I think for me specifically, any kind of white papers that were put out, I would look to see who contributed to them and then reach out and contact them. I think it's about the trust that the member has and the trust that the staff have for the work that you're putting out there. So I think publications are probably the best way for staff to find you. Also, you should reach out and email them. I don't know that you'll always get a response back, but it's more helpful to have the first step be made in terms of educating staff and a member of Congress by the outside than the inside, because they're so busy there that they don't actually know what they don't know. I mean, a great example of that would be like the Cambridge Analytica hearing in the Senate, right? All of the questions that were drafted by staff that those senators asked were pretty poor. They had no idea what the inner workings of a company like Facebook were, of a company like Cambridge Analytica, and it would have been helpful to have, one, the expertise inside Congress already, which is why I'm pushing again that all of you should consider doing some type of fellowship because of how valuable you'll be there. But two, to have communicated with people that had an idea on what actually happened, and that would have helped the hearing, I think, go a lot more smoothly, and at least made the members or the senators seem more informed on what was a very problematic thing and what didn't really get answered at all by that hearing.
Okay, so on that happy note, let me thank the panel.